week 5. It's flying by, isn't it? Week 5 in our 7-week fall series, based on this book up here, Resilient, How to Grow an Unshakable Core of Calm, Strength, and Happiness by Rick Hansen. And just by way of a little review, this is a book about what neuroscience has learned about how the human brain works and how we can use that to help us to be more resilient, strong, calm, happy, things like that. And I think the best way to summarize the primary idea in the book is like this. This is what we talked about during week 1. You can use your mind to change your brain, to change your mind, to benefit yourself and other beings. That's what we're up to here. And the fancy word for it is the fancy term for it is self-directed neuroplasticity. Self-directed neuroplasticity. Say that 3 times real fast. So far we've covered 7 qualities that we can use the mind to develop. 7 down, 5 to go. And today we're focusing on motivation and intimacy. So here's how they describe the relationship between resilience and motivation in the book. Resilience is more than bouncing back from adversity. People who are resilient keep pursuing their goals in the face of challenges. Consequently, learning how to regulate your brain's motivational machinery is a key aspect of resilience. Now, you know what they say about motivation. Here's what they say about motivation. Some days it's hard to find motivation. Some days motivation finds you. And for those of you who are listening to this and don't have the advantage of seeing what's up there, there is a rather large-looking bear, which I would say is probably a grizzly bear, chasing a guy on a bicycle down a winding, slippery-looking mountain road. And that indeed would motivate me. No question about it. So if I had, yeah, that's all right. If I had to come up with one word to describe the theme of this chapter, that word would be desire. Desire can be both the source of motivation as well as a source of suffering, which is one of the 4 noble truths in Buddhism, that the cause of suffering is desire, which is also translated as clinging or attachment. And the truth is that we can't put an end to clinging or desire. The best we can do is to see it for what it is, and then try to keep it as healthy and as positive as we can. And when I heard that in the book, I was reminded of a quote by a modern-day Buddhist teacher named Thanissaro Bhikkhu, who gives us what I think is an excellent perspective on the Buddhist teachings on suffering, clinging, and non-attachment. Those are some of the more difficult things to understand in Buddhism, and I really like his take on it. Here's what he says. He says we start the path to the end of suffering not by trying to drop our clinging immediately, but by learning to cling more strategically. In other words, we start where we are and make the best use of habits we've already got. We progress along the path by finding better and better things to cling to and more skillful ways to cling. In the same way, you climb a ladder to the top of the roof. Grab hold of a higher rung so that you can let go of a lower rung, and then grab onto a rung still higher. And as the rungs get further off the ground, you find that the mind grows clearer and can see precisely where its clingings are. I really like that. That's a really great perspective on this idea of clinging. Learn how to do it in a way that is healthy and perhaps even goal-oriented. So this all starts with a key insight that we get from research in neuroscience, which tells us that there is a key distinction in the brain between liking and wanting. They're regulated by 2 different areas of the brain. Now, we may instinctively think that we want the things we like and we like the things we want, but that's a mistaken impression. What this research is telling us is that they're 2 different things. And And this becomes even more clear when we look at exactly what the word want or wanting means. It has a couple of different meanings. And one of the secondary meanings has to do with, well, we hear the word want being used when we describe someone who's living in want, right? What does that mean? Poverty, right? They're living in poverty. Wanting is synonymous with lacking, inadequate, insufficient. That's a common meaning of the word. We don't hear it quite as often today, but that's what it can mean. When a person is described as wanting, it means that they're unsatisfactory in some respect, that they haven't lived up to expectations. They haven't performed up to expectations. So anytime that we want, and we're using it in that sense of the word, anytime we want means that we desire something out of a sense of inadequacy. And when that happens, it does something to our motivation. Our motivation is creating and drawing on a stress reaction in the body. Anytime that we are experiencing lack or something that is missing that we need, we're triggering a stress reaction. And of course they call cortisol the stress hormone, right? It's released in response to fear and lack and a lot of other things that lead to stress. Getting back to our friend on the bike being chased by a bear, I think it's safe to say that he is truly motivated, but cortisol is probably the driving force, because I would suspect that there's a little fear involved in that whole scenario. Hey, cortisol does its job, but at a cost, because too much, too often leads to all sorts of negative health effects. Now, when we're motivated by the thought that we lack something, that there is something that we have to get in order to be whole, complete, worthy, happy, our behavior is driven. That's an unhealthy form of motivation. Driven behavior can become a compulsion, which is inherently stressful, more cortisol. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to turn wanting into a healthy form of desire, or as Thanissaro Biko would say, a skillful form of clinging. That kind of desire flows from a sense of satisfaction. And in the book, what they suggest is exploring the idea of liking something without wanting it. Imagine that. Can you like something without necessarily wanting it? And they give a brain exercise. They recommend that you look for experiences of having already had satisfaction. I know that runs contrary to what Mick Jagger was always saying, can't get no satisfaction, but think of the times when we felt content or satisfied, and we can use that experience. Once again, this is an exercise that we've seen over and over again. Use that experience to build up a consciousness based on contentment rather than lack. And we have a term for that in Unity, do we not? We call that prosperity consciousness. We look at our lives, we look at the world from the perspective of abundance, wholeness, plenty. And when we do that, we find that it's possible to enjoy things, to pursue things, and even to be ambitious. I know some people use that as a bad word, but not necessarily. We can be ambitious without the stress and dysfunction that comes from wanting. So I guess the formula here is that less wanting equals less suffering. Less wanting equals less suffering. So when our motivation is grounded in a sense of abundance and appreciation, what we're doing is we're triggering a whole different response. We're triggering the reward mechanism of the brain, which is based on the hormone dopamine, which is healthier and more beneficial. Dopamine is far more beneficial and healthier than cortisol. Unless there's a bear. Then I say bring on the cortisol. But otherwise, we want that reward response. That's what we want to trigger and work with. Now, one of the ways that they suggest in the book to keep our motivation based on a healthy foundation is through guidance rather than criticism. And this ties into what we were talking about last week. They say there are basically two ways to get yourself up the mountain of life: through guidance or criticism, through drawing on the inner nurturer or the inner critic. And the inner critic, that's what we talked about last week, and here it comes into play again, because the inner critic is going to feed into lack consciousness. The inner critic is going to leave us feeling inadequate, lacking, wanting, insecure, self-conscious, stressed out, all of those different things. On the other hand, healthy guidance keeps us focused on the goal. It tells us what we're doing right. It builds up rather than tears down, and you can always tell that it's at work because it has a kind and compassionate tone. They say in the book that people often think they need to be hard on themselves to stay motivated. But the opposite is generally true. Use guidance rather than criticism to stay on your course. And again, the practice is to look for an experience. To look for an experience of guidance rather than criticism. And then we use that now familiar HEAL technique, the acronym HEAL, to plant that experience in the brain and make it part of our neural network so that it becomes more automatic for us. HEAL means that we have the experience, we enhance the experience by focusing on it, looking at it, and really getting in touch with what it is that's beneficial or pleasurable about the experience. We absorb it by staying with it, we sit with it and we let it sink in. And then the final step is we link it, and in this case what we're doing is we're linking the positive experience of the inner guidance to the voice of the inner critic, and we're using it to, in this case, drown out the voice of the inner critic, telling the inner critic, thanks for sharing, see you later. Okay, we still have to talk about intimacy this morning. And it's an interesting word because I think we only hear the word intimacy used, or perhaps it's just used too often in the context of romantic relationships. And what they point out in the book is that there are degrees of intimacy in all of our relationships, not just the romantic ones. The word comes from a root word which means to make familiar or known. So in a relationship, intimacy is about this mutual process of making yourself familiar or known to the other. And this was the piece that was so interesting to me. They say that intimacy is all about maintaining a healthy balance between me and we. We need to be both independent in a relationship and interdependent because we're multiplying our resources for dealing with challenges. And in turn, that's the kind of thing, the more resources we have, the more resilient we tend to be. In the book they say this, they say, a strong me in the midst of we fosters intimacy. A strong me in the midst of we fosters intimacy. And here's how that can work. When we're comfortable in our own skin, it makes it easier for us to open to others. But when we're full of insecurity and when we lack confidence, then we tend to project that insecurity and lack of confidence onto the other person. And we can use that as an excuse to push away, to run away, to disengage, or things like that. When we enter into a relationship with a healthy ability to provide for our own needs, we're already in a better position to be responsive to the needs of others. They give us a few suggestions, 4 suggestions actually, for how to grow a healthy sense of me in the midst of we. And the first one they talk about is to focus on your own experience, which means don't get sucked into the trap of making up some kind of an elaborate story about what's going on in the other person's experience. Because while we're making up that story about what's going on with them, we lose self-awareness. We lose track of what's going on in our own consciousness, and before you know it, those feelings trigger thoughts, those thoughts trigger words, and out they come, and that's where things can really start to fall apart. So focus on our own experience. Number 2, imagine boundaries between you and others. This one sounds a little counterintuitive. It sounds contrary to all of that wonderful spiritual stuff that we say all the time about oneness, right? But healthy boundaries are essential to healthy relationships. And this could be the topic of an entire talk. But at the most basic level, healthy boundaries are the limits that we establish to protect ourselves from being manipulated, used, or otherwise violated by others. Believe it or not, there are folks in this world who will do that. Those things can happen in a relationship, and we need to empower ourselves to communicate very clearly by actions, by words, that we will not allow that to happen. We have to be clear about our own values, and we have to set limits based on that clarity. Now, being assertive doesn't mean we have to be aggressive or confrontational about it. We can establish healthy boundaries in a consciousness of calm confidence, which is usually more effective than simply being aggressive. The third suggestion is to assert your autonomy on the inside. And this is a form of positive self-talk. We're familiar with this. We tell ourselves that we can disagree without being disagreeable. We tell ourselves that it's okay to say no. And this is especially important when someone is trying to gaslight us by minimizing our own feelings, our own needs, or telling us that we don't know what we're talking about. Even if you're not in a position to speak out, it's important to stand up and silently and firmly deny what they're saying and affirm that our feelings and needs are valid and that we do indeed have a clear grasp on the issues and facts when someone tries to do that to us. Number 4, call on inner allies. This is where he says intimacy supports autonomy. We rely on our experience of good relationships with healthy boundaries to help us to be able to stand up for ourselves. They suggest trying to imagine what an ally might say when someone is being insensitive, intense, pushy, manipulative, all of those things. Think back on a time when we had a friend, an ally, and what they would say to encourage us in those situations. Now, this is something they've already talked about in chapter 6. And while it's great to have real life examples to draw upon, like a spouse, family, and friends, what they told us in chapter 6 is that you can even use fictional characters to do this. Rick Hansen likes to use Gandalf from Lord of the Rings, who is a pillar of strength and virtue, and he'd be a candidate for me. That's a good one. But I might also add to the list of inner allies someone else that I rely on from time to time. That's the dude up there from the movie The Big Lebowski. And whenever someone would get up all in his face and start trash talking, he has something very wise that he says in response.
Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man.
Yeah, that's just like, your opinion, man. He doesn't take anything personally. He knows how to deflect, and it's probably one of the best comebacks that you're going to hear. That's what an inner ally might say, is that, hey, you know what? That's just like his opinion, man. Don't let it get to you. Don't let him get inside your head. That's the thing. Probably one of the few times it's okay to have an imaginary friend as an adult, right? Think about that for a minute. Okay, so one final word about these foundations for intimacy that we haven't talked about yet. Something he calls unilateral virtue, which I have to touch on because that was a new term to me. But as I read about it, as I learned more about it, it turned into something that was actually very familiar. Now here's how he defines unilateral virtue in the book. He says it's when you draw on autonomy, empathy, compassion, and kindness to be honorable and responsible even when others aren't. This approach to relationships simplifies things. Instead of getting lost in what others ought to be doing, you focus on your own actions. Kind of like Jesus saying, stop paying attention to the speck in the other person's eye and focus on the splinter that's in your own, that kind of a thing. The benefit here is that it helps us to keep our focus where it belongs, which is on the only things that we can ever reliably control, which are our own thoughts, feelings, actions, and words. Doesn't mean we have to be a doormat, but what it does mean is that we lead by example and we walk the talk. Even when we're busy telling ourselves the other person isn't walking the talk, just make sure that we're doing the same, that we're in integrity. And then we can give ourselves a pat on the back for doing the right thing, which is what they call in the book the bliss of blamelessness. I kind of like that, the bliss of blamelessness. Well, that's all for today. We'll be having an informal discussion group at 11:30 in the youth ed area. And of course, Karen's meditation is going to be available on CD in the Spiritual Resource Center. It'll be up online sometime tomorrow. I recommend that you work with that and again use the HEAL exercise to work with experiences that help to bring out that inner guidance instead of the inner critic and to foster that sense of contentment rather than lack. And next week we will move on to courage and aspiration. And here's an easy color, huh? Taupe, is that right? Taupe or tan? I think we got that handled. That should be real easy. See you next week.